afternoon, everybody. My name is Zanele Mji. I'm an investigative journalist at Amapungane, Center for Investigative Journalism. We are the dung beetles. We dig for dung that fertilizes democracy. But for this story, called Those Graves Are Our Title Deeds, I went digging for bones. I thought I'd read you just an introduction to my story, just so you can understand what it's about. And then I'll share for you some of the main lessons and the themes that emerged for me in writing about this story. Dotted around the upmarket neighborhood of Fourways, crumbling graves hide in plain sight alongside busy roads and the boundary walls of townhouse complexes. They belong to the people who once lived and worked on the hundreds of farms that made up northern Johannesburg before it became one of the city's fastest developing and most expensive areas. The graves are among a handful of burial sites that have remained in place since property developers began to develop the area in the 1980s. Since then, developers have relocated thousands of farm graves to local cemeteries. Graves have been at the center of a long dispute between private property developers who own Dainfern Golfing Estate and the poor black farm workers who were moved from the land in the 1970s and 1980s to make way for it. For the farm workers and their families, the graves, some of which date back to the 1800s, are their only tangible link to land that they were denied formal ownership of during apartheid. The interrelated network of families who own the graves have lived in the area since at least the 19th century. They are collectively known as Amandebele, and their presence in northern Johannesburg dates back to the splintering of Shaka Zulu's chiefdoms. So, for Mposo Spielman Ngoma, Fourways will always be home. So yeah, that's the story. This is the story of Mposo Spielman Ngoma. Him and his family belong to a community of people that were forcibly removed from an area of northern Johannesburg 30 years ago under apartheid laws. It's a story of how they lost everything. They lost their homes, they lost their belongings, they lost their livestock, and they lost hundreds of graves, which becomes an important theme in this story. It's a theme for the indignity of how they were treated. It's a theme for how their spiritual and communal lives were splintered. And it's a theme for how, under apartheid and colonialism, they had no other formal proof of their claim to the land other than these graves, which date their presence in the area. To give you a visual idea of the setting of my story, that is the Dainfern Golf Estate, where the community was moved 30 years ago, and that is Diepsloot Township, where the subject of my story now lives. You just need to look at these two pictures to see why land is a raw nerve in South Africa. It's a massive crime that took place over a very long time period and had such far-reaching effects. And in the limited time that we've had in democracy, South African democratic institutions it's been a sluggish and corrupted process in trying to reform and restore and address these land crimes that took place over apartheid. And it's a raw nerve because people live this reality every day. I mean, every morning people wake up in places like Diepsloot and they travel very, very, very far distances to where they work, in places like Dainfern, and they have to travel back at the end of the day. So it's not a nerve that has ever had a chance to heal in South Africa. So the main lesson I wanted to share from you that I got from this investigation and other work that I've been doing about land is that stories about land are stories about people. An expanse of land, especially in a storytelling perspective, an expanse of land has very little significance unless you put on industries, homes, people, communities, rituals, and graves. And that's when it gives things meaning. So to quote one of my favorite feminist writers, Audre Lorde, the personal is the political when it comes to covering land stories. And so in this story, I realized that journalists and investigative journalists really have an opportunity to bridge that gap between the personal and the political. And this can take place in two ways. Firstly, we should do work that centers people's experience of these historical crimes and these massive crimes that took place when it comes to land issues. And that is, we should write stories that, sure, take the data into account and the numbers and the statistics, but stories that also qualify that data, qualify the shocking and the sad data that makes land such a raw nerve in South Africa. I think it presents an opportunity to really earn the trust of the public. If we produce work that guides them meaningfully to how we got to this place where things are so raw and so painful. I think the second way we can bridge the personal and the political, I think right now in South Africa there's a big conversation going on around land expropriation without compensation. And I think there's a danger of that becoming another slogan or a platform for politicians if our public doesn't keep them accountable. And the way we do that is to be informed, is to know who our public institutions are, what is their current track record for handling land issues, how seriously have they taken the land reform process so far, and what have they done to protect vulnerable people. And then we can sort of separate the nice ideas from the realities that really affect people's lives and guide people through understanding those differences. So I thought I'd just share with you some opportunities for investigation. This is in the South African context that I've come across in my work. The first is in land claims. So like I've said, our land claims process has been stop and start, it's been dogged by legal issues, and it's been corrupted and mismanaged, and there are so many stories to be told around South Africa there. I think land is tied up in issues of inheritance, and in my experience I've learned that inheritance is a very gendered issue. So in the stories that I've looked at, the person who loses the land is male, the person who takes the land is male, and I think in those settings, in some ways it makes women the double losers when it comes to the land conversation. I think women are also fighting in South Africa against traditional governance structures that don't recognize their land ownership rights, and that's another huge opportunity for investigation for journalists in South Africa. And then just some laws and policies and acts that I've come across in my work: the extension of the Security Tenure Act, the National Environmental Management Act, and the Communal Property Associations Act. This is some of the legislation that's been passed in South Africa that is supposed to help with the land reform process and to protect vulnerable and land-hungry communities. There's been a lot of problems with implementation, again, corruption, and a lot of complexities of the lived experience of these laws and these structures that I think journalists would do really, really well to reflect. And then just the last opportunity that I wanted to talk about was collaboration. Land stories are incredibly immersive. It took me a good part of a year to write this story, to work on the story. They have long time periods, like I said, the layers of personal, political, historical, and so I think it's not a place where newsrooms should compete. I think journalists should really, really investigate opportunities for collaboration, especially for newsrooms that are removed from the geographical area of the story. Local journalists often have understandings of the things I spoke about, the religious, the communal, the local context, the languages, the cultures, and an understanding of the history. And I think if investigative journalists can look at ways to come together to kind of split this massive, sensitive tasks, I think we do quite well. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
Alois, so